For years, people thought they already knew the story. Two young pop stars, one wildly successful reality show, and a marriage that seemed to collapse right in front of the entire world. Nick Lachey was the cool older guy from a hit boy band. Jessica Simpson was the rising superstar nobody could stop talking about. Together, they looked perfect, like the kind of couple built for magazine covers and red carpets. But behind the cameras, something very different was happening. And 20 years later, the truth sounds far sadder than anyone realized. Before the fame became overwhelming, before the headlines and divorce rumors, Nick and Jessica were just two young musicians who genuinely fell in love. Nick was already established as part of 98 Degrees, competing with groups like the Backstreet Boys and NSYNC during the peak of the boy band era. Jessica was younger, just 18 when they met. A church girl from Texas with a huge voice and a father managing every part of her career. They started dating in 1999, and at first, it felt like a fairy tale. But there was one detail that would later matter more than anyone expected. Jessica was still figuring out who she was. Nick already knew exactly who he was. And that imbalance quietly shaped everything that came next. They got engaged in 2002 and married later that year in a huge Texas ceremony. By all accounts, they were deeply in love. Jessica would later describe Nick as her first real relationship, her first love, her first everything. But while the public saw romance, there were already pressures underneath the surface. Nick was 28. Jessica was only 22. He had already experienced years of fame and industry pressure. She had grown up sheltered, religious, and incredibly inexperienced with adult relationships. At the time, nobody thought that mattered. But looking back now, it may have been one of the biggest warning signs of all. And then came the reality show that changed their lives forever. In 2003, MTV approached them with a simple idea. A small reality series about newly married life. Nobody expected much from it. It was mainly supposed to help promote their music careers. Just a few episodes. A fun side project. But the second Newlyweds, Nick and Jessica aired, everything exploded. Millions of viewers became obsessed with watching their everyday lives. Their arguments. Their chemistry. Their awkward little moments. Suddenly, America felt like it knew them personally. But here's where things get strange. The more famous the show became, the more damage it may have been doing behind the scenes. Jessica quickly became the breakout star. Audiences loved her openness, her humor, and her lack of filter. Then came the moment nobody forgot. Jessica holding a can of chicken of the sea tuna and genuinely asking if it was chicken or fish. The clip became iconic overnight. It followed her everywhere for years. But later, Jessica admitted something shocking. That ditzy persona was partly an act. She intentionally played herself down on camera because she wanted viewers to love Nick. She wanted him to look smart, patient, and grounded. She was trying to protect the image of the marriage. And in the process, she accidentally destroyed her own public image. That one decision followed her for years. Suddenly, Jessica Simpson wasn't treated like a serious artist anymore. She became the punchline. The dumb blonde stereotype attached itself to every headline. Meanwhile, Nick escaped most of that criticism completely. And that imbalance slowly started changing the power dynamic between them. Because while Jessica was being mocked publicly, her career was quietly becoming massive. The show turned Jessica into a business empire. Movies, fashion lines, beauty products, platinum albums. She became one of the biggest celebrity brands in America. Nick benefited too, but in a different way. The show made him relatable. Viewers saw him as the normal guy trying to manage chaos. He became more popular on television than he ever had been through music alone. But their careers were no longer growing at the same speed. Jessica's fame exploded into something enormous. Nick's career became steadier, smaller, more personality-driven. And inside a marriage, those kinds of shifts can create pressure nobody talks about out loud. If you watch Newlyweds carefully now, you can actually see the cracks forming in real time. Small arguments, tension during conversations, moments where they clearly wanted different things. Producers later admitted the friction was very real. It wasn't scripted. And the hardest part was this. They no longer had privacy. Every disagreement existed around cameras, microphones, producers, or public expectations. Imagine trying to fix your marriage while millions of strangers are watching and judging every interaction. That kind of pressure changes people. By the third season, the emotional distance between them had become impossible to ignore. Jessica's schedule was non-stop. Movie shoots, interviews, endorsements, tour. Nick later admitted the marriage started slipping away before either of them fully realized it. And then another complication entered the picture. During filming for The Dukes of Hazzard, rumors began swirling about Jessica and co-star Johnny Knoxville. Years later, Jessica admitted there was an emotional connection there. But she also made something very clear. The marriage with Nick was already breaking long before that happened. The outside connection wasn't the cause. It was the symptom. Then suddenly, the show ended. And only 7 months later, Jessica filed for divorce. What happened next shocked Nick completely. According to multiple accounts, Jessica brought up divorce after dinner one night, and Nick never saw it coming. Publicly, the split was explained as irreconcilable differences. But privately, the damage had been building for years. And then came another problem nobody expected. The money. Before they got married, Nick had suggested signing a prenup. Jessica refused. Not because she was thinking strategically. Because she was 22, deeply in love, and believed asking for legal protection meant the marriage wasn't real. At the time, Nick actually had more financial success anyway. So nobody worried about it. But by the time they divorced, the entire financial situation had flipped upside down. Jessica was suddenly worth tens of millions. Nick was worth far less. And because there was no prenup, California law meant marital assets would likely be split evenly. Jessica later admitted refusing the prenup became the single biggest financial mistake of her life. Reportedly, Nick walked away with millions in assets, investments, and business stakes connected to Jessica's growing empire. But here's the surprising part. Nick never publicly attacked her. Never trashed her in interviews. Never turned the divorce into a public war. Instead, he poured everything into music. In 2006, Nick released What's Left of Me, an album heavily inspired by the heartbreak. The title track became one of the biggest solo hits of his career. And listeners connected with it because it felt real. Raw. Honest. You could hear the exhaustion underneath the lyrics. The sadness. The confusion. It was the sound of someone trying to understand how a marriage collapsed without fully realizing it was collapsing while it happened. And then came something even stranger. For 20 years, Nick and Jessica had almost no contact at all. No public reunions. No friendship. No drama either. Just silence. They completely disappeared from each other's lives. Both moved on. Nick married Vanessa Manillo in 2011. They built a family together and eventually became the faces of Netflix's Love is Blind. Jessica married former NFL player Eric Johnson and expanded her fashion empire into a billion-dollar brand. On the surface, both seemed to have found peace. But then, in 2026, something happened nobody expected. Nick and Jessica ended up on the same flight to Hawaii. After 20 years of zero contact, they suddenly found themselves trapped together on a 6.5-hour flight from Los Angeles to Kauai. Entire families included. Nick was there with Vanessa and their children. Jessica was there with her mother. Reports say the first moment was awkward. Some sources claimed Jessica moved seats after spotting him. Others said the interaction became surprisingly friendly afterward. But maybe the most fascinating part is this. Nothing dramatic happened.
No emotional confrontation.
No public meltdown. Just two people who once shared one of the most famous marriages in America, calmly existing in the same space again after 2 decades apart. And honestly, that says everything. Because the real story of Nick Lachey and Jessica Simpson was never just about celebrity gossip or reality television. It was about two people trying to survive impossible pressure while growing up in public. Jessica was only 22 when the marriage started. She entered adulthood while millions watched her every move. And in order to protect the relationship, she sacrificed the way the world saw her. Nick, meanwhile, carried the image of the stable, relatable husband while quietly struggling with a marriage he didn't fully understand was slipping away. The media treated them very differently too. Jessica faced endless criticism about her body, intelligence, and appearance. Tabloids mocked her constantly. Nick never faced the same level of ridicule. And that difference shaped how each of them rebuilt afterward. Jessica spent years reclaiming her identity. Nick spent years learning from the heartbreak and building a quieter, more grounded life. Both changed completely from the people audiences watched on Newlyweds. And maybe that's the real ending here. The marriage didn't survive. But they did. 20 years later, there's no bitterness left. Just distance, maturity, and perspective. The painful divorce that once felt like the end of everything eventually became the beginning of entirely new lives for both of them. A billion-dollar business. New marriages. Children. Careers rebuilt from the ground up. And one unexpected flight over the Pacific Ocean that proved something neither of them probably understood back in 2005. Healing doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like two people sitting quietly on the same plane after 20 years apart, and realizing the pain no longer controls them.